Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's session of conference, and we're looking forward to a really exciting session today. My name's Claire Small. I'm a consultant MSK physiotherapist, and I'm also a newly elected CSP council member. One of the things for me as a council member is to really be available to hear the views and ideas of members. So please, if you've got anything that you want to put front and centre to the CSP and its council, come and find me at the break or this evening at any time. I'm really excited about today's session. I run a multidisciplinary sports and exercise medicine business where we treat lots of females, and what we've seen over the time is that the need for the sports and exercise medicine world to speak to the world of pelvic health is ever evolving. So it's absolutely fantastic that we've got a session today on the female athlete, sex-specific considerations, sports medicine and pelvic health. So I'm here to introduce the chair for today's session, which is Dr. Gillian Campbell. She is the research lead for the POGP, which is the professional network for physiotherapists with an interest in pelvic health. She's a clinical academic at the University of Nottingham and an NIHR School of Primary Care Research postdoctoral fellow. And she works clinically as a specialist PhD physiotherapy in Derbyshire. So please join me in welcoming Gillian and her colleagues for this afternoon's session.
Thank you very much, Claire. Thank you very much for coming to our symposium today. We really wanted to present it because female-specific issues are often overlooked in the care of athletes. We plan to do this by focusing on goals such as pelvic health. I'm so sorry, I'm really struggling here. We're going to look at body image, menstrual cycle considerations, and our final presentation we're really keen on because Sophie is going to look back at some of these issues specifically from an athlete perspective. So, can we start with one of the most taboo areas for discussion, and that's pelvic floor. Oh, I'm terribly sorry. Is that better? Yes. Sorry about that. Okay. So we're going to start with one of the most taboo areas for discussion, and that's pelvic floor dysfunction. And why would that be important for all physiotherapists to consider? Well, symptoms such as urinary incontinence, anal incontinence, and pelvic organ prolapse are incredibly debilitating for women and really, really common. Urinary incontinence alone is thought to affect nearly half of the women in the UK at some point in their lives. Commonly accepted risk factors are having babies, being overweight, and getting older, and for women, particularly as they go through and beyond the menopause. Over the last 10 to 20 years, however, there's been an increasing body of evidence published regarding the fact that symptoms such as urinary incontinence are also really prevalent in young, fit, and otherwise healthy elite athletes. And in fact, in 2018, there was a large study published where the authors reported that the elite athletes were nearly 3 times as likely to experience urinary incontinence as a matched group of non-athletes. It's also important to note that in most of these studies, the athletes had never reported their symptoms before, neither to a coach or to a healthcare professional. It's probably as a result of these studies that we started to wonder whether elite sport was also an additional risk factor for the pelvic tissues. So two quite contradictory suggestions were initially proposed, and the first was that maybe the loading from sport and exercise, and in particular impact, might actually be stretching or weakening the pelvic floor and other tissues. And that makes sense when we consider that sports, high-impact sports like trampolining, have got particularly high prevalence rates. So 80% of trampolinists will report symptoms like urinary incontinence. The second suggestion, however, was that general exercise might actually strengthen the pelvic floor. So we know that in general, athletes tend to have stronger pelvic floors than non-athletes. And when investigators started to look in a lot more detail, what they discovered was that incontinent athletes often have stronger pelvic floors than athletes who don't leak. And that seems quite counterintuitive until you consider that the pelvic floor is a complex group of muscles and so can be dysfunctional as opposed to just being weak or lacking in endurance. So more recently, investigators have looked at multiple aspects of pelvic floor function. And in August last year, there was quite an interesting study published where the investigators had looked at function, strength and control of the pelvic floor in a group of 39 runners. And what they reported was that the runners who were leaking were better able to recruit their pelvic floor. And what I mean by that is they could recruit it more quickly and more strongly. They also noted that these women seem to have reduced passive pelvic organ support. And what I mean by that is that the bladder and neck sat lower within the pelvic cavity than it did in the other women. Now, you can't deduce from that, is that reduced pelvic organ support linked to the impact from running? Or actually, do these women already have a predisposition for problems before they take part in their sport? They did suggest that perhaps this increased rate of force development and increased strength might actually be a compensation for the reduced support, which makes quite a lot of sense. But we still don't know, is sport an aggravator for symptoms or is it a risk factor for the pelvic tissues? So in Nottingham, we started to think, well, if sport is a risk factor, then surely recreational athletes who are more likely to have all the other risk factors, so having children, being older, and even being overweight, are likely to have even higher prevalence rates than that of the elite athlete. So in the summer of 2022, we launched an online survey, and that was to investigate prevalence rates of pelvic floor dysfunction in recreational athletes, but also in women who didn't exercise. And from that, we thought we'd be able to identify if there was any associations between taking part in sport and experiencing symptoms. So we had a fantastic response. In less than 3 months, nearly 1,600 women took part. Most of these were quite young, most had children. We actually set the bar for exercise pretty low. So we set it at UK guidelines for healthy living of 150 minutes a week. 70% of those taking part said that they were exercising at or above those levels. And most of them were doing so 3 or more times a week. And over 90% said that they had been exercising at these levels for over 5 years. When we started to analyse the data, that was quite a surprise. So really high levels of all symptoms were reported. Previous authors have suggested similar levels of anal incontinence and pelvic organ prolapse, but nonetheless, these are really high levels. And yet, only a third had ever reported their symptoms before. So we then started to drill down to see if there was any associations, and we did that by adjusting for other risk factors such as parity, assisted delivery, obesity, constipation, and age. And that was even more of a surprise. We couldn't find any association at all. So initially we thought, we've set the bar for exercise just too low. So we divided the exercisers into low level, moderate level, and high level. High level was over 10 hours a week. No associations were found. So we then thought, well, impact's probably the key. So we divided the exercisers into high impact activity, HIIT classes at the gym, running and so on, and low impact activity or no impact activity like swimming, cycling, rowing. Still, we couldn't find any association. It's important to note it's an internet survey, so there's huge potential for selection bias. We did advertise for all women to take part, symptomatic or not, taking part in sport or not. Inevitably, if you have an interest, you will click the link. It's also important to note these are recreational exercisers, and as such, they can stop or modify their activity if they experience symptoms, unlike the elite athletes. However, given that 90% of our exercisers said that they've been exercising at these levels for over 5 years, I think we can tentatively suggest that for these women, it doesn't appear to have increased their risk of experiencing symptoms. So what do we take from that? Well, it's important to remember high levels of all symptoms are reported by women, and yet most will never go to see anybody. So it means that as healthcare professionals, we really need to start having these conversations. We don't have current evidence to say that sport is a risk factor. It might be, but it's important that we stop telling women as soon as they present with the symptoms to stop everything. Instead, we should manage it like we do any other musculoskeletal condition. And that might, in the first instance, be by offloading in order that the tissues can recover or the muscles can improve their strength. But thereafter, you should prescribe a progressive loading program in order that they can return to sport. So thanks very much. We're going to delve into screening and management of pelvic floor dysfunction a lot more detail with Gráinne Donnelly. So I ask you to welcome Gráinne to the stage. Gráinne, she's an advanced pelvic health physiotherapist. She works in private practice in Northern Ireland. She is our current editor of the Journal of PRGP, which is our peer-reviewed academic journal. She's an internationally known pelvic health tutor. She's currently studying for her doctorate at Cardiff Met University, and she's also the mother to 4 young children. So, wow, hats off.
Hello, everyone. I don't know what mic I might use, so I'm just going to go with it. But I want to talk today a little bit about sports medicine and the pelvic floor. It's an area I'm particularly passionate about, and I think that there's a huge disconnect when really we should be joining the dots and all collaborating together. Glad to see lots of male representation in the room too, so I'm happy to be bringing this conversation forward. I've already had a nice introduction, so I'm going to move on. So, do we need to consider pelvic health within sports medicine? Yes, good. As I say, I often feel like the pelvic floor is very much overlooked, and we only have to look at some examples in the literature to really see how sports medicine deals with the body from head to toe, but it definitely sidesteps the pelvic floor, and it's someone else's remit. And Gillian's already unmasked some of the problems of this, because if we actually ask athletes, are they having symptoms? Well, yes, they are. And is that going to be affecting performance or ability to train and compete? Yes, it is. So these are 2 really well-known groin pain publications, and they're great, very high-level, high-quality publications. But while you see that they both contain representation of wider lumbopelvic anatomy, neither contain representation visually of the pelvic floor, nor mention it in their write-up. And I find this particularly difficult in terms of differential diagnosis. As physiotherapists, that's our job, that's what we do so well. But if we think of even external rotators of the hip, obturator internus has a role in that, but it's also part of the pelvic floor complex. So are we truly engaging in differential diagnosis if we're not considering screening and uncovering any potential dysfunction at the pelvic floor? So what is the pelvic floor and what does it do? Do we have, how many people in the audience are pelvic floor background? Not that many, this is good, okay. So the pelvic floor, as you can see, is a large group of muscles spanning the base of the pelvic outlet in layers. And the base of the pelvic outlet is wider in females than in males, and it has an extra orifice in the form of the vagina. So we rely on the structural support of that region, and we really need it in terms of all the demands that we're going to do for everyday life. We're talking about keeping women physically active today, but we have to consider everyday function and what women are going to be doing, chasing after kids, having kids, we're going to talk a bit about that, and all the things that intervene to compromise the pelvic floor. So its role isn't just about controlling urinary incontinence, because when people, and sports medicine has got better at starting to talk about pelvic floor dysfunction, but it tends to stop at stress urinary incontinence. And yet the role of the pelvic floor is to control continence in the bladder and bowel, facilitate emptying of the bladder and bowel, support the pelvic organs, and it also has a role in sexual function. So any compromise to the function of the pelvic floor will impact any, and indeed all of these roles, so we must be screening for that more widely. If we look at the pelvic floor from above, I really like this illustration we got created. It shows the unique anatomy of the female pelvic outlet, and this area called the urogenital hiatus is actually particularly important, and a study that Gillian finished talking about, the Berube and McLean study, it was a really interesting study because they scanned women with ultrasound transperineally to look at the surface area of that region, and they sent them running, both continent and incontinent, and it included nulliparis athletes, and it actually showed, I'm talking about the same study, aren't I? Yeah, we are. It actually showed that you look confused, I think. It actually showed that the runners came back, even those who had no symptoms of pelvic floor dysfunction and had not had any babies yet, they had an increased dimension in the urogenital hiatal area, which is probably a normal adaptation. So when we load or put the pelvic floor region under any sort of stress, it adapts momentarily in the same way as if we stretch our leg, we can get lengthening in that tissue, and then it probably recovers. But what happens then if we have further compromise to the pelvic floor, like we go through vaginal childbirths, we have other dysfunctions, we're layering onto that normal mechanism that might change the surface area, and then suddenly we can predispose symptoms. So again, one of the biggest risk factors, and sorry, that's a bit of a gruesome image, but I was going to say we definitely take a huge hit to the pelvic floor by way of vaginal delivery in particular. And I do think that when we consider it in this way, we are better at considering why we need to rehabilitate women, particularly after having babies. Having babies has become a really normal process. Women do it all the time. They're amazing. They get up, they go back to work, they go back to life. But they're living with significant consequences. And when we consider that we give people and refer them to physiotherapy after keyhole knee surgery, I think we need to reframe and start to level out the playing field here. So when we talk about that distensibility at the perineal body, I like the analogy of a trampoline, because if the trampoline becomes too distensible and you can sink way into it, that's going to affect the function of the pelvic floor. Or if there's any compromise to actually the structural integrity, so if we have really significant traumatic deliveries during childbirth, that can also impact the function of the pelvic floor. And in terms of symptoms, as I said, it's not just about leaking. There's any of these symptoms here can predispose or suggest pelvic floor dysfunction, so we really need to be asking. And for the non-pelvic health clinicians, you do have a role in screening. You don't have to know what to do with the person if they have pelvic floor dysfunction, in the same way as you screen for red flags or screen for signs of neurological issues and signpost, or rheumatological issues and signpost. We need to be better at screening for pelvic floor dysfunction symptoms and then saying, look, there's actually something we can do about that, and signposting them where they need to go. So a really nice study done by Jodie Dakic in Australia really uncovered how much of a barrier pelvic floor dysfunction is in terms of keeping women physically active. So even across from recreational exercises to higher level exercises, you can see that almost 50% stop being physically active. Now, as physiotherapists, no matter what area we work in, we know that keeping people physically active is a public health priority. It's essential for our overall health and well-being. So if we're identifying and uncovering an almost 50% barrier, we need to do something about that. And you can see that different sports had different sort of impact, and we'll talk a little bit about sport-specific considerations later. Gillian already mentioned it, very few, particularly athletes, tell anyone about their symptoms, and what they tend to do instead is all the telltale signs of reducing their fluid intake before they go to that exercise class, running to the toilet forward and back before, during, after. So even look out for things like that, or ask people, because a lot of women don't even realise that that's a sign of pelvic floor dysfunction. They've normalised it. So what can we do? I love this screening tool that was put out by Sylvia Giaggio and her team. It's the PFD Sentinel. It was published in the BJSM. It's open access. It's currently undergoing validation tests, and I like it because, particularly if you don't work in pelvic health, it's quite easy to use. There's only 5 questions of symptoms. You can even, if you feel awkward asking these questions, give it to the patient and ask them to tick if any of those are relevant. You know, it breaks down barriers to getting this information. But we can also risk profile. So the second part of their outcome measure shows it gets you to tick any of these factors that are relevant to the patient in front of you, and the more that you tick, the higher the risk or the higher the odds that that person might develop pelvic floor dysfunction if they already haven't got symptoms. And the good news is, and it's one of few areas of rehabilitation that we can stand proud and say we have grade A level 1 evidence that pelvic floor muscle training works for the prevention and management of pelvic floor dysfunction. So we really need to be getting that message out there loud and clear. I don't know if any of you have ever broached the subject of pelvic floor training with your patients, but did they know what it was? Did they know how to do it? Many women don't, so we need to be the educators, and you can even tell people about how to do a pelvic floor exercise even if you don't work in the area. So I have a few cues, because the one cue doesn't work for everyone. That there, I like my wee transperineal imaging, because it's going to show what happens when someone draws in their pelvic floor. So you'll see the rectum moves superiorly and anteriorly towards the bladder neck, and it slightly lifts the bladder neck. I like to play that because I like for other professionals to understand there's a range of motion involved in the pelvic floor. It's a blind muscle area that we don't see, and I think people think it's a wee itsy bitsy muscle and you just do wee clenches, but it's actually a vast group of muscles, and it actually has a range of motion. And like any area in the body, we train that with the same strength and conditioning principles. So I have a couple of cues, everything from close or squeeze the ring of muscle at your back passage. One of my favourites is think of a zip from your back passage to your front passage and think of closing that zip. But different cues mean different things to different patients, so work through them and find one that works with them. And as I say, we need to go through the same principles of specificity, overload and progression. So if we look at Tiana Madison, former Olympic champion from the USA, we can appreciate by the nature of the repetitive load and impact going through the entire lower limb and ultimately reaching the pelvic floor, that we need to have a pelvic floor that's fit for purpose if we're going to be doing things like this. So we need to be getting our women strengthened, and we need to be more proactive in it. Let's not wait until people are 6 years symptomatic before they're brave enough to ask a GP for referral. Let's get good messaging out there, inform younger teens and adults, and get people stronger. But it's not just about our local pelvic floor. We've got a pelvic floor and we're attached to a whole person. So what factors might impact? Now this study this was a clinical commentary I put out in 2022, I think. It was in the context of returning to running postpartum, but the principles apply across other populations, and the fact that different bodily systems do impact our pelvic floor function and our ability to exercise. So even things like, if we think about the postpartum woman, even things like energy levels, do you ever consider relative energy deficiency in sport or REDS in terms of postpartum women? Well, this is a population who are likely eating on the go, sleep deprived, maybe lactating, expending more energy, and maybe feeling pressure to get back to physical activity and exercise. So we need to be thinking of their energy input-output and educating appropriately, because go into a situation of REDS and they increase their risk for bone health. They're going to have menstrual health dysfunction as well. And in that paper, we have a little checkbox of little things that you can prompt you to ask questions to find out some of those wider biopsychosocial factors. I never do a talk without mentioning uniforms, because particularly when we think of the athlete population, they may be leaking, they may be having symptoms, they may be having babies going back to sport, and we're putting them out in itsy bitsy teeny weeny yellow polka dot bikini type uniforms. And that's not very discreet for if someone is afraid of leaking or is afraid of anything happening or just has body image compromise. So I think that we need to be, if we've any influence in sports designs, we need to be informing it and using our voice. A lot of team sports have changed white shorts to darker coloured shorts, so we're having some positive change. But there's a lot of adjuncts that can help. So like any area of rehabilitation, if someone is having pelvic floor muscle symptoms or dysfunction, we can keep them active while they rehabilitate, or if they reach a rehabilitation plateau, we have things that can help. There's things like pessaries, intra-urethral support devices, which help control the continence mechanism. I'm researching compression garments as part of my PhD, and I'm challenging my own biases with those, because we're starting to find some of the interactions that they're having with some women. So don't be afraid to liaise with your local pelvic health physio and find out what this patient could have to keep them active. Now, if you want to take a deeper dive into sports medicine and the pelvic floor, we wrote a whole paper on it. It's open access, and we actually got the paper of the year last year, which we were delighted about. But it goes through all the different factors involved in it, and it's a good read for anyone who wants to look a little bit more into it. And just to talk a little to sport-specific considerations, we did a study and we showed that even within a rugby team, player position actually made a difference to someone's odds of leaking, and that made sense. Forwards were more likely to leak than backs, and that's because they undertake more tackling tasks and they usually have a higher BMI. So we need to be thinking of sports and even player positions and the roles involved in it, and we need to be thinking even different sports have different trigger risks for pelvic floor dysfunction symptoms. Someone may not be leaking in any other sport until they go to high-level volleyball and are doing smashdowns, and that's the only time they provoke their symptoms. So it's all about load tolerance of the pelvic floor for the type of task they want to get involved in. There's lots of really good resources for pelvic health that you can access. So English Roses have a nice rugby toolkit. GAA in Ireland have come out with a player welfare book, but look up the Australian Institute of Sport, which has a lot of free-to-access athlete-facing and professional-facing leaflets and videos to upskill you on things like menstrual health, pelvic floor dysfunction, breast support, all the usual female-specific considerations. So to finish, we need to screen, and that includes all of us, not just pelvic health physios, signpost or treat depending on scope, educate, get the word out there, and we need to monitor and surveil this population, and we need to be collecting data like Gillian's highlighted. So thank you.
We're now going to continue the themes of load management and screening, but this time within the world of dance. So please welcome Bill Taylor. Bill has been working as a physio for nearly 40 years, 25 of these in pelvic health. He, alongside running his successful Edinburgh clinic, he works with Scottish Ballet and Scottish Dance Theatre. He was integral to the specific post of a consultant physiotherapist to the National Ballet. He continues to work with dancers of all ages, and he too is an internationally known and renowned pelvic health tutor. Welcome, Bill.
Well, I don't feel so lonely today, so right on, guys. Glad to see you here. The only thing that you have to know about today is that it wasn't really on the piece of paper, you know, like the program. But if you show up to today's talk, that means that you have to become a pelvic health physiotherapist. And you have to sign a form before you leave. So, yeah, we need more. So it's really good to see people interested in this field. I've been in pelvic health for a long time. I'll see if I can find my first slide. I always feel a bit of an imposter when I come to speak at these things, because although I've been in pelvic health for a long while, I came from an MSK background, and I still see 50% of my caseload as MSK. But I think I've absolutely come to believe that you can't be a MSK physiotherapist without looking at the pelvic floor. So if you think you're an MSK physiotherapist and you're not looking at the pelvic floor, start. Because it's like looking at a knee and only looking at quadriceps. It's like looking at a hip and only looking at the adductors. You're missing a vast area that needs to be looked at. So my background really in the last few years is a lot of dance physio. And I was at Scottish Ballet for a long while. And dancers are very interesting. Has anyone worked with dancers before? Yeah, good. So if you say to dancers, if you ask them to stop doing anything, what do? They never come back to see you. Okay, they run away quite quickly, and they're not really interested in anything you've got to say. And I have to say, when I was at Scottish Ballet, I wasn't a pelvic health physio initially, and I never asked dancers about their pelvic health, what was happening, whether they were incontinent, whether they were leaking, or what symptoms they had. And yet we had dancers that would go away and have babies, come back to dance, and still be leaking. You think as well, dancers are strong, right? They shouldn't leak. Look how strong they are. We see them on stage. We see them how they perform. And in actual fact, they often tend to be, when you tested their pelvic floor, they weren't very, very weak at all. They actually had pelvic floors that were overactive. But at the end of the day, pelvic floors are always all about physics to me. If the pressure in your urethra is less than the pressure in your bladder, or the other way, if the pressure in your bladder is greater than the pressure in your urethra, you're going to leak if those muscles aren't strong enough to stop that happening. So dancers do get stress urinary incontinence, and they don't complain about it, and they don't tell anyone about it. They wear skimpy leotards, and they wear pads, and they do all sorts of things to hide it, to not bring it to your attention. They also got pelvic organ prolapse, and they get red S syndrome. And they get red S syndrome, which is relative energy deficient syndrome in sport, because they're in that group of sports athletes who have to look a certain way. They have to be thin. They can't be heavy for the aesthetic. Also for dancing with their partners when it comes to being lifted and when it comes to actually performing dance. So they get things like, how do you know if a dancer has a pelvic floor dysfunction? Well, if you're in the studio during class, they're the dancer that goes to the toilet a lot. They can't do a whole class without leaving. They're the dancer that they maybe have some pain in their pelvic region, hip pain. And Gráinne already talked a little bit about the anatomical connection between the pelvic floor and the hip, and also the functional connection. I see a lot of people with pelvic floor dysfunction, and to make them continent, I don't really work on their pelvic floor. I strengthen their hip external rotators, which has an effect on their fascia, which is where the pelvic floor muscles are insert into, and they come back and say, I feel better. And there's a couple of studies been done looking at people having total hip replacements. So after they've had the total hip replacements, they've woken up and they're fully continent, having been incontinent before. That's not a strength thing. That's a change in function, a change in length, a change in tension. So they get low back pain and they get sensation or heaviness. So I wonder if I could get can I get the walkie about speaker thing? Do you still have it there? So basically, we've got 35% of female professional dancers reporting UI, which is a significant number, I feel. It's similar to the number, thank you very much, similar to the number in other high-level female athletes. It's a significant occurrence in both dancers that haven't had babies and also dancers that have had babies. 52% attribute the leakage to physical activity, and stress UI was more common than urge UI. It was this really repeated high-impact movement that increases the intra-abdominal pressure. And I think one thing that we talk a little bit about is that pressure management system. So core, diaphragm, and how that connects to the pelvic floor. Leaking can occur with jumping, and it's associated with sufficient pelvic floor muscle strength. Poor coordination, again, contraction and other core muscles exacerbate the risk in dancers. They're asked to perform fairly complex, rapid movements repeatedly. And there's a paper by Silver 2018 that found core intensive exercises often resulted in incorrect recruitment of pelvic floor muscle function. And I think there's this thing about they don't have face validity, the pelvic floor muscles. We don't see them. You don't connect to them easily. So what kind of happens is if you squeeze, there's ways of making that isometric contraction happen, but is it happening in the correct way to work along with the pressure system to actually maintain continence? So we need to maintain physical health without compromising performance. If you want to get dancers to go along with anything you want to prescribe to them, then the big thing you have to say is that it will improve their performance. It will make them dance better. Because if it's not going to do that, it's like athletes, they're not going to do it for you. So women often, and again, the biopsychosocial aspect is they often experience embarrassment, they have decreased self-confidence and social isolation. And it's a significant concern for dancers because they can sometimes, the dance world can be a tough place to be. You get a lot of rejection. Even although you're in a company, you still have to audition for the roles that you want to play. So you might not admit to having an injury. You might not admit to having a pelvic floor that's not functional because you don't want to be missed out for the next big role. And Carrie Boo 2007 highlighted this fear. The fear of leakage, not the actual leakage, but the fear of leakage that can interfere with athletic performance, concentration, and overall quality of life. And for us, that's really useful because if you want to get dancers to kind of be compliant with an exercise program, if you can tell them that it will actually help their performance and make them dance better, then you've got an in. So how do we manage it? Well, pelvic floor management and muscle training is commonly prescribed treatment of SUI. And again, it's the same paper that Daniel mentioned, the Demoulin et al. 2018, did a systematic review and meta-analysis and confirmed that pelvic floor muscle training is first-line treatment for SUI. It's level 1A evidence. But I think the thing is, just squeezing your pelvic floor often isn't enough, especially for dancers who do functional activities, jumping, loading. And you have to take that isometric pelvic floor rehab and move it into a much more functional arena. So Buetel found that dancers who engaged in pelvic floor muscle training saw a significant reduction in incontinence, and it reinforced this need for pelvic floor re-education and structured training programs. I think prevention education is really important in young dancers, especially if you're at that pubertal age where you're kind of embarrassed with your body, it's changing, you don't want to talk about it. And Grania was saying you're in a skimpy kind of outfit, you might start your period, you might feel embarrassed already. So dancers often overlook the importance of pelvic floor muscle training, mostly because they spend a lot of time in turnout. So they spend a lot of time in external rotation of their hips with their posterior hip muscles contracted. So they feel that they all walk about. Dancers walk in a certain way, don't they? Like this. They all walk like this because they don't relax through their hips. And it's partly one of the ways they keep their pelvic floor switched on. So the other thing that we see in female dancers is pelvic organ prolapse. Where's my glass? I just wanted to talk a little bit about this because it's a condition where the pelvic organs descend from where their normal position is due to weakening of pelvic floor muscles and tissues. And there's an impact on these pelvic floor muscles and the tissues with high impact activities. The risk factors are things like intra-abdominal pressure, overuse of the pelvic floor muscles, core rigidity, and menstrual irregularities. All of those things that we see in dancers, because they walk about with this, they squeeze their bum, they turn their hips out, they tuck their tail under, and they pull up their pubic bone to get their belly flat. They want to look a certain way. They want this aesthetic that they want to have on stage. It has an impact on performance. They have a feeling of heaviness and dragging. They have difficulties with bowel and bladder control. They impinge on the ability to train effectively. And again, it comes back to this reduced performance quality, or even an early end to their career. And this is just a kind of a less horrible picture than Grania had to just show the idea that the pelvic organs kind of descend through the pelvic floor, the pelvic hiatus. So how do we treat it? Well, again, focus is really on conservative management. Again, muscle retraining is really good. Key management approaches include pelvic floor muscle retraining. But I think they have to be adapted to what the dancer does. I'm really much, and I get a lot of pelvic floor muscle retraining is done with people lying down or sitting. Dancers don't lie down and sit very much. They're moving a lot. So you need to take the training off the bed, and you need to get them being a bit more functional. Again, regular pelvic floor muscle training is shown to reduce the symptoms and the progression of prolapse, so it can stop it getting worse and make it better. Look at posture alignment training, which again is almost trying to get them to relax a little bit because they tend to be a little bit rigid. They tend to be a little bit holding their rib cage. They tend to be about not letting things go. And that tends to be in ballet rather than maybe kind of contemporary dance where, and it depends, there's lots of different types of genres of contemporary dance that are a bit more loose and floor-based. And I'm not sure, there's not that much evidence to look at the different genres of dancers. But in ballet, definitely that idea of overactivity is a problem. We want to look at activity modifications. We want to try and take them to an area where, let's say if you wanted to get them to do an exercise like a squat, and maybe perhaps with a squat with 60 kilos, that squat's going to give them prolapse symptoms. You take some of that weight off until the prolapse symptoms disappear. And if you like, it's similar to a 1RM from a strength and conditioning point of view. You load them up to that point before the symptom starts, and you train them at that level, because an isometric contraction isn't just going to cut it for them. And then this idea of vaginal pessaries, which I used to say, it's a bit like putting an ankle brace if you sprained your ankle and you want to get someone back to activity soon, except you're putting it inside, which makes it a little uncomfortable and a little bit difficult to see. So you need to be specially trained to do that. Luckily for me in the clinic, I have one pelvic health physio who does that. But the vaginal pessary idea is there's a kind of an idea that vaginal press is for old people. They're not for young people. But in actual fact, prescribing a press can get someone back to heavy lifting. If you've got a prolapse, you're told not to lift heavy. You're told to avoid lifting. But in actual fact, we need to take you to that graduated return to lifting. And we need to actually increase your ability to take that load and do the exercise to get you back to being functional. Is that not blank? Here we go. So the last thing I'm going to talk about, because Jill said I could have 10 minutes. So my very last slide is actually 4 slides, okay, with everything squeezed onto it. So relative energy deficiency in sport, RED-S, and it arises where there's a mismatch between the dancer's energy intake and their expenditure. Its low energy availability underpins the concept of RED-S, and it's basically they're not eating enough, and they're not eating enough for different reasons, and it has this cascade effects into physical performance and psychological issues. Physical are things like menstrual dysfunction, decreased bone density to fatigue, increased illness and injury, gastrointestinal issues, weight issues, decreased endurance, poor concentration. So all of the things that they don't want, they need to be concentrating, they need to have energy, they want to be healthy, they don't want to get stress fractures. So they want to make sure that they minimize their injury rate. They want to be able to keep dancing. They don't want to miss rehearsal. They certainly don't want to miss performance. And then the idea of psychological depression, anxiety, irritability, and disordered eating. And I have worked with a good number of irritable dancers, and if you're working with dancers, irritability is one of the real key signs that you know they're probably not getting enough calories in, and they're not eating enough to. And there's a lot of education that we have to do to get them to understand that they need to fuel their machine. They need to fuel their body. If they want to dance at their maximum, they need to eat enough. So the etiology of RED-S is inadequate caloric intake, dieting for weight control, high energy expenditure. So dancers will go into the studio at maybe 10 o'clock in the morning, and they might be in the studio till 6 o'clock at night, and they'll do that 5 days a week plus a Saturday morning, when they would go in on a Saturday morning for a class for 2 hours. And then if they've got performances, they might have performances once a night every week, and twice on a Wednesday and twice on a Saturday. So a significant amount of energy expenditure. Things like psychological and socio-cultural factors, body image pressure, how you're meant to look. Now, ballet is changing, and kind of the body, it depends on where you are with ballet and what your artistic director is looking for. He might like tall, lean people. He might like medium height people. He might like muscular. And we're talking about women here, but this travels into men as well. So they might like muscular men. He might like tall, thin men. And so it changes what they eat. And it's interesting, when I used to hang out at the studio, I used to go and walk around where they'd have their lunch. I'd go and sit down and just kind of like do a little unconscious kind of, what are you having? What are you having? And I'd make little notes. It was probably like completely illegal. I'd make little notes about what they were eating, and then it would give me an idea if they came in and there was some others, if their injury wasn't improving, if they were getting too many stress fractures, if there was an issue ongoing with the dancer, you could actually say, so if I want to get you back to rehearsal, if I want you to get back to performance, then I need to make this recovered. So what do you do? What do you eat? How many meals do you eat a day? What do you eat? Are you eating protein? Are you eating carbs? What are you avoiding? Things like sport-specific risk factors, so prolonged periods of physical exertion, and that can be, for example, we did Swan Lake about 3 or 4 years ago, and Swan Lake is about 3.5 hours long, and the rehearsal for that is incredibly intense, especially if you've got a lead role in that. You can be on stage for maybe 20 minutes. Now, 20 minutes of dancing is like 3.5 minutes of boxing. It's really, really, really hard work, okay? So we got biological factors, things like energy deficient affects reproductive hormone, leading to menstrual disturbances, amenorrhea, which again could potentially help sort of influence them later in life if they want to have a family, if their periods are disrupted, if their ability to produce eggs changes. So it's not just about their actual that moment in time when they're a dancer; it's what they're going to do for the rest of their life. And then this idea of misconceptions about body composition, what they think that having a light body or having a certain type of body means that you'll function better. This was really 3 slides, but it's 1, so I apologize for the amount of stuff that's on it. But it's, I'll put that there. So its treatment is typically multidisciplinary, dietitians, physicians, and mental health professionals and physios. We have a big role to play in this because we're often pretty close to these guys. We're looking at exercise management and monitoring because they think dancers never want to stop. They never think they've done enough. There's never, they don't really understand when they have to, they don't understand periodization. Periodization within the dance world is something that isn't really considered very much. And we need to be able to take time off. We need to, I lobbied at Scottish Ballet for them to have Saturday mornings off. They feel that every hour missed in the studio, every single hour missed dancing means a reduction in your ability to dance. When in actual fact, it's almost the opposite. Sleep, nutrition, rest, and making sure you get time off is the thing that gets you to perform better, dance better. Things like rehab programs for stress fracture, muscle injuries. I used to always feel if we got to a stress fracture or a muscle injury, I'd kind of failed them a little bit. I hadn't actually done my job because I really wanted to stop them. I wanted to stop them before they got to that stage. And then focus on recovery and strengthening. If you've got someone with an injury, the biggest thing you can do for them is have a big educational component to their rehab about how you don't want this to happen again and how you have to get them having a better diet. Things like injury prevention with biomechanical deficiencies, osteoporosis, soft tissue injury, strength training. And one of the things we did with injury prevention at Scottish Ballet was we introduced a weekly screening program where we would actually get them to come in on a Friday morning and they would say how were they feeling, how did they think their eating had gone that week, how high could they jump, what was their strength test? What was their hand grip strength test? Because there's association between that and onset of shoulder injuries. There's association of ankle injury risk and a reduction in jump height. So we would look at these things to see if those metrics changed. And if they would change, we could kind of get in before the injury happened and actually try to prevent them. And actually, when we did that and we introduced weight training, we reduced our injury rate by about 55% within about a year. So screening, education, getting in there, being preventative was a good thing to do. We can help them track their menstrual health. We can work with athletes to understand the connection between mental health and the overall performance and energy balance. Screening again, early detection. Listen carefully. Listen, I think this thing, a long time ago when so I've been a physio for a very, very long time. And I say something quite a lot, and I'm going to share it with you here. My old professor in my physiotherapy school said to me something once, listen to your patients, because if you listen to your patients, they'll tell you what's wrong with them. And you just think about that for a minute. It's really true. How many times are you running around and you don't actually have the time to sit and listen? But then she said something else. She said, listen to them a little bit longer, because if you listen to them a little bit longer, they'll tell you how to treat them. Because that's what they do. Because they tell you what they want. They tell you what they want to do, and you can figure out how you're going to put that into a practical rehab program. This idea of collaboration with healthcare providers, psychological support, and we were super lucky at Scottish Ballet because we had a great psychologist, nutritional guidance because we had a nutritionist, and then return to sport protocols. What are they doing? Understand that if they go back, that part of the rehab isn't just strength training, loading, and muscle training, but it's actually about what they're eating and how they're living their life as well. So the take-homes are really that stress urinary incontinence is common in dancers. They often don't seek help. Same as in the usual public community. Need for education, the importance of the pelvic floor. Physiotherapy prescribed pelvic floor muscle training is first-line treatment. And also pelvic organ prolapse is common. And again, pelvic floor muscle training is first-line treatment. And I think in physiotherapy, I just want to underline that because actually in MSK, how many level 1A pieces of evidence do you have for anything that you do? Not many. I can't even think of one. In pelvic health, we've had that for quite a while, and we're developing it further and further. So if you're not comfortable teaching someone pelvic floor muscle training, then make sure you refer them or signpost them to somewhere that they can get information about it. So redness in dancers occurs due to inadequate energy take. It's driven by pressure to look lean, leads to all these different hormonal menstrual bone health changes, and it basically culminates in impaired performance. And to be honest, that's our big out, because if they're they're not performing well, and I say if they do this and they will perform better, I don't have to ask them anything else. They'll do what I ask them. Thank you very much. I'll leave that there. Cool.
So, thanks very much, Bill. We're going to move away slightly from pelvic floor now. I'm going to look at menstrual cycle considerations in athlete health. And I'd like you to welcome Rosalind Clark. Ros is a highly experienced MSK and sports physiotherapist. She is a lead for the module in sports injury rehabilitation at UCL as part of their Masters in Sports Medicine, Exercise and Health. She started working in sport in 2012, and initially that was with England Netball, and ultimately she was the physio to the Lionesses. And she continues to work clinically with British Equestrian and is co-lead for the Active Women's Clinic. And she's also studying for a doctorate at University of Birmingham. Thanks, Ross.
Thank you, Judith. Thank you, everyone. Did you turn this off? Bill, did you turn this off? No? Oh, it is on. It's just me. Okay, sorry about that. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to talk about menstrual cycle, and I'm going to consider, is it the golden snitch of female athlete health? So for anyone who's not watched Harry Potter, which I'm appealing to the younger half of the generations in here, or that you've read this with your child at some point. The golden snitch is in a game called Quidditch. If you catch the snitch, you win the game. Unless you're Slytherin and we don't like you, okay? So we're going to consider it that around this, and the menstrual cycle is something that's quite a hot topic on social media, as a lot of things are, and especially in female athlete world. Okay, so menstrual cycle. Here's a picture of it. I could have put a really fancy graph up. There is a more fancy graph about hormones going up and down, but I like simplicity, and it's a cycle, so we are like a circle. Okay, and there's some different phases for it. I'm not going to stand here and lecture you about all the different phases and what happens and blah, blah, blah. That's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about what we need to think about and how we use this information and its impact on us as physiotherapists. So it's poorly understood by the population, so people who experience menstrual cycles, healthcare practitioners and researchers. So it's something that's been happening since the dawn of time, since women have roamed the earth, and we don't really understand it. But if anyone's ever seen, there's an amazing anthropology description of a bone that's got carved with a 28-day mark on it, and someone said it's the first calendar. No, it's probably the first period menstrual cycle being mapped, okay? So it's been around a long time, but we don't understand it. It's rarely discussed in clinical conversations. We've already alluded to that when we talk about pelvic health symptoms, but we don't talk about menstrual cycle either. Okay, there's a lot of social stigma and shame associated with periods, okay? We try and hide them, conceal them. I would say there is a shift and change about that. Emma Pallant, who is a pro triathlete, came on a period in the middle of an Ironman. She's wearing white and blue, very see-through kit, and she's actively bleeding while she's riding her bike because she's got to ride a very long way. And so we're starting to see athletes talk about it as well, but there is social and stigma and change. It's a really important indicator of our health, okay? This is sort of a really important indicator that lets us know once a month our hormonal health is working well. Those systems are in check, okay? So it's important to track it. There's lots of options to do that. Now, I'm not going to get into the depths of how you track what you want to do, but what I would say is that health data also is a commodity and businesses want your health data, so you just need to be maybe aware of how much data you're giving away. And when we put that stuff into apps or into your Garmin or into whatever, we are giving big organizations lots of health data. So that's up to you as an individual to understand how you want to track it or use your health data, but you can always use paper and pen in a diary, okay, if you don't want to give it away. There's lots of unknowns out there about the menstrual cycle at the moment, and we'll see that in some of the evidence. There's lots of unknowns, but there's lots of influencers who will tell you great stories or exactly what you should eat, exactly what you should do, exactly what training you should do in which bit of your cycle. Hopefully, by the end of today, we might have a more balanced viewpoint on some of those ideas, because what the evidence says and what the gurus say can be quite different. Now, we know that that's a challenge as healthcare practitioners when we engage with patients and we talk about about lots of things. So menstrual cycle is not unique. Okay, so we're going to split this down into performance first. That's one of the worlds that I work in. And I'm interested about keeping athletes available to train. If they're available to train, okay, they can then be selected, they can go on to then perform. It's not my job to make them perform, it's make them available to train. Coaches get paid a lot more money than me to make them perform. So, sports science, we always see these articles come out about, let's track female hormones. It might be, again, a really important thing for us to understand. So if we look at McNulty's work, what is the impact of menstrual cycle? Well, actually, there's a trivial reduction during the early follicular phase of the menstrual cycle in terms of your ability to express force. Okay? Trivial. Okay? So when we use this word trivial effect size, it means statistically it wasn't great. There was something, and we needed to write something probably in the results section, okay? So trivial, also, when we measure anything in research, we're reducing that data probably down to a mean. So we're taking the breadth of a population and we're bringing it down to a minimum number. Also, with the McNulty's work, they found there was a large variation between studies, and it was of poor quality. Like every good systematic review we've ever read, poor quality studies do more research, okay? And from this, actually, some individuals may experience more symptoms at certain phases of the menstrual cycle, which may impair their training. But we have not got enough evidence to globally say what people should do in each phase of their cycle. We don't have that evidence, okay? We will all have different experiences if you have a menstrual cycle of what that feels like and what you feel like doing. Some days you feel like on top of the world, you want to, you can do all the things. Other days you just want to eat chocolate, sit under your duvet and watch Netflix, okay? And everyone has an individual experience, so we need an individual approach. We then also need to consider that a lot of people are on oral contraceptives or hormonal contraceptives, so they don't have a true menstrual cycle. They have an artificial menstrual cycle from taking hormones, okay? And again, there's a lot of reasons why people choose to go on contraception, not just to not have a baby, but also in terms of managing symptoms as well. So we need to understand and athletes want to understand if being on an oral contraceptive will affect their performance, because ultimately that's what their job is, they want to perform. So the OCP might result in inferior exercise performance, might. Not definite, might, okay? The group level effect is trivial. So when we group these people together, again, there's a little wobble of the line, but it's not a significant trend or dip away. Exercise performance is consistent across the cycle, so there isn't a change. And for those who work in high performance, we might need to look at this on a more individualized approach. But again, what we're not seeing are these really significant effects from either being a normally menstruating person or being on an oral contraceptive. So we don't have enough evidence in the bank. And Kirsty Elliott-Sale, who's based at Man Met, was preaching on Twitter the other week really loudly for the people at the back. We still don't have evidence to periodise training based on a menstrual cycle. Okay, this is the work from Finley, where they actually looked at how then do we manage menstrual cycles for people in elite performance, and this is based in rugby. And they considered having a multimodal approach, which is really happy for us as physios. We're very comfortable with that concept. So having a point of contact, understanding a profile, so monitoring it. And why do we want to monitor it? Well, actually, like we said, it's an indicator of health. As Bill has already alluded to, Red S is something we're going to mention in a moment. Losing your menstrual cycle when you've had a regular cycle is a big, big red flag. We need to incorporate menstrual cycle into regular monitoring and some education. So if we know that someone's very symptomatic in the first few days when they start bleeding, and their training volume is very high on those days, are there things that we can do to help support them? Do we need to change what they're doing on those days? Not because we think that there's an increased risk of injury or anything like that, but actually because they're not going to be able to give their best effort. Do we need to make sure they've got access to appropriate analgesia, other symptomology modifications? So we don't want to stop people training. We want to empower them to make decisions and be able to monitor their body. Okay, so relative energy deficiency in sport, Red S. This is the updated version. So Mountjoy paper came out again in 2023, okay? So like Bill has already alluded to, it's a multi-system problem. It also doesn't affect just women, it affects men, okay? And it's not a single clinical entity. So you're not going to put on your diagnosis just RED-S, okay? It's a multifactorial. It's not always intentional, okay? So it used to be thought of, definitely in aesthetic sports and dance, we do see that there may be some deliberate calorie restriction, but it's not always intentional. It's sometimes a lack of understanding of how much energy their expenditure is going on. They don't understand, and actually the volumes of food or fuel that they need to take in to compensate for that. It's poorly recognised in early phases because athletes are very good at adapting or changing, and they keep training. So we don't always see big, clear clinical markers in the early phases. So when people lose their menstrual cycle, it's a very late symptom. So the tank is already pretty empty. If we think of it as being like a fuel gauge, we're in the red and we're trying to eke it round the corner, you know, and get to that petrol station that's just past the traffic lights. So if we got to that point, you know, we're not in a great place. If you're a hormonal contraceptive user, you're still at risk, okay? So you're not having a normal menstrual cycle, you're still at risk of this, and your performance impacts of RED-S are significant, and I know Sophie's going to talk about that in her amazing talk in a moment. But we can screen for it, we can assess, and we can manage it, but it requires a multidisciplinary team. I always would describe RED-S patients, it's a bit like opening Pandora's box. You don't quite know what's going to come out of it, and there might be lots and lots of factors that interplay that lead them into this situation. Okay? And what's the impact on performance? Well, you can see that from the diagram here. But also, we need to think about when our patients and athletes are at high risk. So they can have changes in their physical quality. So if we're regularly monitoring athletes and we see changes in their force output, for example, or endurance, that could be an indicator. They can coexist with underperformance syndrome. Those are two things that can coexist. For the high-risk athletes or patients when they're in rehab, but also in our hormonal transition groups. So puberty, perinatal, perimenopause, and menopause. Okay? So RED-S is not just for young people. It's not just for athletes. It's for everyone. Okay. Menstrual cycle injury, hot topic. Hot topic. I was going to poll the room, but we're not going to do that. So you can see, this is me doing a quick PubMed search. So this is the number of papers if you put menstrual cycle and injury into PubMed. So you can see it's become really popular in the last few years. We see that trend upwards on the graph, okay? And what we have found, because I think we were hoping this was going to be the panacea to stop all of sort of the lower limb injuries that we see, which come with really high burden, is that we thought this was going to be the golden snitch. I'm not quite sure it is. But what we are seeing is that phases with high estrogen may influence soft tissue compliance. May in italics here, because we've got individual variation. So it may influence soft tissue compliance, collagen formation, and tensile properties. That's pretty relevant for most of our body tissues. So in Tom DeSantos' work in 2023, it was a big systematic review. Again, similar findings, low quality evidence, not enough studies, really difficult to group people. It was found to be inconclusive that there was a clear link between menstrual cycle phase and injury. What they did find was that in the mid-luteal phase, there was some increase in knee laxity, but it varied. And then Barlow's work found that actually when they looked at injury in terms of incidence, there was a greater incidence in luteal phase. So we're getting different stories here. And that they found actually that they had more muscle injuries were most common, and they were during premenstrual phase. So we're not seeing the big ACL injury, we're seeing muscle injuries in luteal phase. So our confidence in this evidence is pretty low, it's variable, and our methods and our research designs are probably the biggest limiters for us understanding this question. It's really difficult to subgroup people. People who have menstrual cycles could be on lots of different contraceptives as well, and will experience menstrual cycles in different ways. So it's really hard to come up with a binary answer, which is like all good research, yeah? It always remains grey. And there's also this question around, well, actually, if we think menstrual cycle is a big issue, well, let's just stick everyone on hormonal contraceptives and take that out. That doesn't sit well with me as a female, as a person, and actually the evidence out there doesn't correlate with that either. So the menstrual cycle on its own is probably not the answer. Hormonal contraceptives on their own is also not the answer. So what is the answer? So I'm going to talk about ACLs, because I love them, but I also like to call them a celebrity ligament, because you know, apparently they are the showstoppers of, you know, the back pages of the sport. All right, so a celebrity ligament, I'm going to rephrase it as. Okay, so why should we try and stop getting ACL injuries? So we're going to go quick into MSK here, make half the MSK house feel a bit happier. So ACL injuries are really expensive in terms of time, cost, performance, athlete asset availability, and time on us. So they also lead to decreased activity, muscle atrophy, altered movement patterns, and loss of physical properties that can remain for long periods of time. From a sport perspective, like we said, we lose the asset, the athlete, for a prolonged period of time. They impact on our performance. We know that teams that have more injuries don't perform as well. It may impact our funding, the cost of medical care, and our time demands on support staff. In the female professional world, that also means we don't always have a lot of staff compared to the male half of the programs. In professional sports, so if you've got one physio and you've got 3 ACLs, that's a big workload to work through. Okay, public perspective, we all have opinions, especially on social media. So we might perceive that ACL injuries are part of the sport, that it's risky, that it's a female issue. Players are always injured at a certain club. It may have an impact on the performance of your team. You know, your team are like top of the league and then you lose your key striker for an ACL. Man City example, as we're in Manchester. You know, that can be, as a public member, that can be a problem as well. And as an athlete, this could be career-ending or changing. We might miss out on, you know, the Olympic Games, the big events. We have loss of earnings, loss of contract. You might feel isolated, and your identity as an athlete can be seriously compromised. So it's quite important that we probably try and challenge this. Okay? This amazing piece of work is around looking at other factors. So we've tried to say, looking at this ACL perspective from a female point of view, that gender actually in our experiences as females going through a sporting system and how we experience sport and injury and rehabilitation can have significant impact on our risk and our outcome from rehab. So this was written by Parsons, Cohen and Becker in BGSM. It's open access in 2021. Don't panic about references, there's a QR code at the end. But what I think it's really important is that we try and challenge some of the gender stereotypes and challenges that we see. So we need to be bias wreckers. It's really important. And why do I think that's important? Well, if we look at our artistic sports, and we look at some of the reviews around movement, is that actually, so the work coming from Bruton, she found that there's no consistent evidence to support the presence of sex-specific patterns of movement or muscle activation. So it's not just a girl thing that we all land in valgus. Okay, it's not just a girl thing that we do certain things, okay? Sex differences which arise in terms of how people express force or move are probably more influenced by the environment that we put people in and not just their biology or their menstrual cycle, okay? So differences reduces as skill increases. So if you get 2 skilled operators, their sex gender doesn't come into play. And then we probably see this more, Barbie was always going to feature today, in dance and gymnastics, okay? All right, because if you think about the level of training and specialisation that happens in both of those, you all start together and you all go to the gym or you all go to the studio and you go through a similar pathway. This is from my colleague Cherie, and she very kindly let me use her slide, but this is what we tend, this is probably, again, a bias wrecker. So we want to try and make different assumptions about how we train and encourage women and girls to be active. So yes, we really want to educate them around their bodies, around their menstrual cycles, but we don't want to use that to instigate fear or reasons not to engage with physical activity. We know that girls and women give up physical activity for a whole heap of reasons, but it happens far too readily. So we need to be really clear about trying to take away some of those barriers. And as physios, we have fantastic opportunities to do that in all our interactions day to day. Okay, so we want to try and move away from this viewpoint that girls and women are injury prone, or they just, you know, it's something that happens to you. Okay, the environment can influence that. We also want to take away this focus away from just being it's a result of your menstrual cycle, or the fact you have a different pelvic floor, or we want to think of people more globally and how they can work and move. And rather than just thinking about the marginal gains, which might be appropriate in certain environments, it's not appropriate for everyone, and we need to think about actually access to training, encouraging girls to take risk, photography, not being worried to fail in the weight room, those sorts of things, and making the environment where they can perform and thrive. Okay, so what comes next? Well, I don't know because I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not Professor Trelawney, but I would like to be. Will injury rates, as professional sport increases within female sports, will that bring greater resource and greater understanding and support services? Hopefully. We know that that's happening. We're seeing that in football. I don't know if you guys, I'm hoping you guys watched some of the Olympics. This is an amazing rugby player, Iona Meyer, plays for USA. She was really prolific for her body, talking about body image and being different shapes and getting girls being active. She also managed to secure funding from Michelle Kang for £4 million for their programme, which was pretty impressive. So very cool. But we are seeing rapid professionalisation, so we need high quality practitioners who want to work in that space to help athletes. Will the menstrual cycle have an answer for us? Maybe, maybe not. But what we probably will see is an individual effect, and research design is going to limit that. So we just need to understand that there is a spectrum, and for some people it may be more of an issue than others. Let's support them and find strategies to keep them active, keep them engaged, keep them training. Will we get more comfortable in society as things change and professional athletes are seen more readily? Hopefully. Okay, and then what can we do? So risk factors, understand them. They're not diagnostic all the time, but they might be prognostic. Using profiling and monitoring to help us understand and individualize, understand that there may be a challenge between female athletes performing as athletes and how they look, and then create an environment in which they can thrive. So there aren't barriers. Things like you've got access to menstrual products, you can get to the toilet, you can get referred on to see pelvic health when needed. Engage in the conversations. Be prepared, you might get asked some really, really big questions and not have the answers. That's absolutely okay. And if you can, please contribute to the knowledge. Last one. Oh, no, let's go back. I'm going to leave this up quickly because if you scan this QR code, it will take you to all the papers that I quoted in my thing. And there's some additional information and resources on there for you. Thank you.
So thanks very much for that. Our last speaker today is Sophie Shriver. She instigated this symposium, and she's going to bring together some of these issues, but under the athlete perspective, which we thought was really brilliant. So Sophie was selected to be part of the GB Start rowing programme, where athletes aspire to perform at the Olympics. Sadly for Sophie, that was cut short by injury and possibly relative energy deficiency syndrome. But it did drive her to become a physiotherapist through a master's programme. She currently works with clinically, but also with Porsche Motorsport, and she wants to facilitate more female participation in that sport. So thanks, Sophie.
Hello, I'm Sophie. So I'm talking about my personal athlete experience in relation to injury risk, menstrual cycle, and Red S. So, a brief background. When I was 17, I did a program called Girls for Gold. So, from this, I was selected to be on the GBR Start rowing program. This aimed to turn athletes with the right metrics and strength into Olympic gold medalists. I then went to a university with a GBR Start rowing program and studied a degree in sports and exercise science. Here I learnt so much about high performance sport, injuries, training hard, and the differences between males and females. One section on our monthly testing program, was if we could do a press up. Boys who started at the same time as me could easily do quite a few, yet myself and my female teammates couldn't do one. It took me nearly a year of full-time training before I was able to do 3. This is where I started to notice a difference, and this is where my passion for promoting females in sport started. I then got injured badly and had to give up rowing. I also stopped being able to do a press-up. My physio throughout rowing was amazing, and he inspired me to become a physiotherapist. My dissertation focused on preventing injuries in elite university rowers from the coach's perspective. And this is where I actually did some thorough research and started to learn more about the potential differences between males and females in sport. I am now a musculoskeletal physiotherapist in private practice, and I'm in my early stages of a women's health career. I also work for Porsche Motorsport in my spare time, and I've worked for W Series, which is a female-only race series, and this is where I learned some really big differences between males and females. But that's for another day, because that's a whole other topic. So, if it changes. So, my experience as an athlete was one of the best times of my life, but also the worst. I made lifelong friends, I was the fittest I'll probably ever be, and I had some amazing experiences. Although it was a period of immense pressures, under-eating and overtraining, and lots of injuries. I had a lot of expectation on my shoulders. I'd been given a great opportunity, lots of support from friends, families, professionals. I had exceptions at university, and I had my own personal goals and aspirations. In any sport where it's all about power to weight ratio, I feel there's always going to be issues around weight, however much we try to avoid it. I was determined to be as lean and strong as possible, but I also wanted to be thin. Our nutritionist at the time didn't give the best advice, so myself and my friends made our own rules, and we ended up massively under-eating. The result, a real lack of energy, a dip in performance, and an inability to do anything other than row, and lots of injuries. Although the main thing I reflect back on is a real lack of understanding. So I was an athlete, I was not a physio, and this is why I really think this is really, really important. I had a very shallow knowledge of injuries and the mechanisms behind them. I couldn't tell you the difference between a muscle, tendon, or ligament, and how was I to know the effect at a cellular level that under-eating and overtraining was having? I didn't know I was in the peak bone-building phase of my life, and I wanted to be aiding that by eating a well-balanced diet. I knew about fueling myself, but I didn't understand the balance between fueling enough to perform whilst maintaining healthy bodily functions and under-fueling to lose weight. The pelvic floor, obviously I knew it was something, but it was only until my placement at university that I found out it was a proper muscle. Some of my friends said they leaked when lifting weights, or laughing, but I had no idea why. A coach of mine said it was because they were breathing wrong when lifting. But we were young, we were strong, surely there was more to it than that. But no one ever spoke about it, and I was never told anything about it. Then my menstrual cycle. I knew from things I'd read on social media about the menstrual cycle, or I'd been told by a friend that stages of it could increase your chances of getting an injury. But I never actually researched it myself. I was too busy training, living, and studying. Although when you do have a look, it's a minefield. Some research says the luteal phase, some says the follicular phase, whereas I was more focused on what my next session was. So, the menstrual cycle was a big topic of conversation when I rode. Other than press-ups, this was my main distinguishing factor between males and females. Yet it was never really addressed. We still completed the same training as the males, even when we were in a lot of pain. We logged it, but hardly any alterations were ever made. I don't think anyone really understood the effects it could have, or if it did have any effects in this sort of environment. And actually, were there bigger issues to be addressed, such as eating more? We all had an immense desire not to be seen as weak. I viewed myself as mentally tough, well, as tough as I could be. I used to view my period as a weakness of mine. I hated people knowing I was on it, as I thought they'd blame my lack of performance on it, and if I was more grumpier than usual, they would use that as an excuse, when actually I was just exhausted in general. I'm unsure where this assumption has come from. My presumption is that the perception of it is formed with how you're brought up around it and how we discuss it now as professionals. If it's seen as taboo and as an awkward subject, then surely we're going to have more negative feelings around it. From my dissertation, the coaches I interviewed all brushed over the different stages of the menstrual cycle, stating they know it can have effect, but they didn't really understand why, and actually they needed to do further research themselves, which wasn't exactly encouraging. Although one theme did arise, the coaches discussed an increased injury risk when athletes were menstruating due to the pain experienced, stating that pain can cause athletes to change position, which could increase injury risk. Rowing is a sport where your position is really important. The movement comes from the legs and the hips, revolving around hip flexion and the maintenance of a strong, straight back. Rowers spend hours upon hours in this position, and if you're experiencing high levels of pain, the likelihood is you're going to adapt your position to cope with that pain. And actually, this adaptation in position can place forces through parts of your body that aren't adapted to take them. And so this is applicable to other sports where the maintenance of a position is really important, such as cycling, kayaking, weightlifting. And actually, this is when we should make some adaptations, like Ross said. Swapping an erg for a bike is really important. You're not going to have much effect on their training, but actually they're going to feel more comfortable and it might reduce some injury risk associated with it. So, REDS as an athlete. At the time, I had very little understanding. I'd heard the terms REDS, but in all honesty, I didn't know much about it. I just had a friend that had a diagnosis, but that was it. I'd heard about some common symptoms, but to me it just seemed like daily life. I had many more symptoms of it that I didn't know existed, and no one ever questioned if I had it or not, even though my performance declined and I had loads of symptoms. So during the years I rowed, I was in my peak bone building phase of life. During this time, I'm massively underate and overtrained. So according to research, my bone density might not be optimal now. I've not had a DEXA scan. I would like to potentially see if there is any effect to my bone density, but I don't know. Although I do have quite bad arthritis now. A few of the doctors from my young arthritis clinic have said that in my time rowing was a contributing factor to my arthritis from the sheer force experienced and due to potentially having REDS. When having discussions around REDS with athletes and coaching staff, I think it's really important to stress the fact that there are many symptoms of it and a few that you can't tell the athlete has without blood work. The discussion should also include the long-term effects and the importance of a multidisciplinary approach to diagnosis and treatment, with the gold standard involving a whole sports medicine team. These are the discussions we should be having now, as the awareness has already been improved. So this is how I try to apply it today as a physio. Obviously, I'm still quite a junior physio, so this is why I try to apply it. So I have two main points on this. The first is social media and superficial knowledge. There's a perception that young athletes can know more than they actually do. They know so much about their specific sport and the common injuries around it that they come across very knowledgeable. But in reality, do they have any depth to that knowledge? Secondly, social media is brilliant for giving us so much information at our fingertips. Although how often do we read just the first sentence or the buzzwords before scrolling on? Because I know I do. We get exposed to so much content, yet how much time do you take to consume it? It's the same with athletes. They've seen the bold words saying the follicular phase is when you're most likely to get injured, but do they know when that is, what that is, or is that piece of information the most up to date? There is no harm in explaining it twice, as you might always learn something new, but the athlete most likely will learn from it. My second most point to take away from this is I wish the long-term effects were explained to me. For example, the effects of undereating and overtraining. And how injuring my back and hips multiple times could have long-term effects, as I now have arthritis. It probably wouldn't have stopped me, but if I had had more information, I now would feel a little bit happier and more accepting about it, as I could have made an informed decision at the time. Finally, a common phrase I used to use daily, and I've heard recently used many times throughout sport, is pain is weakness leaving the body. But actually, pain is an indicator of something, and we should listen to it and try and adapt to it. Yeah.
So thanks very much. I apologise, we've gone over quite a bit, but I hope you don't mind. But we've got a short period for Q&A. We've got people in the room can ask questions, and we've also got people online who may want to ask questions. If you'd like to put your hand up and say who you are and who you would like to direct your questions to, we can start. Yeah.
I'm Sophie, I work in MSK outpatients at the moment, but I was a dancer for most of my life and also worked in groups for about 16 months. And a lot of the things that I used to get asked were firstly with teenagers wanting their parents out of the room, and then the only actually being able to speak to me about it because I was mentioning personal experience and it was important to ask. But a lot that I'm getting told is things that I see on TikTok, things with influencers. I've got friends, people that I went to school in and got degrees in events management and media and marketing that are now on a public platform talking about the menstrual cycle. And I just wanted to get your opinions on the dangers, but also how social media can be used with talking about these. They're talking about Red S, they're talking about the menstrual cycle, and preaching this information, and it just seems like a really dangerous area for young people to be getting their information from.
I can project. It's a great question. I think it's not just a challenge. I think it's a challenge for us as a profession as a whole, if I'm being really honest. And I would say that with the viewpoint of, if we stay in the MSK world, because that's my other world, you know, there are a lot of rehab experts. There are a lot of, you know, do these exercises cure your back pain? You know, so I think what we're seeing is that the rise of the guru is coming into social media. What we need to be better at, I'm in my 40s, I'm not on TikTok because I don't have time. But what I need to be better at is understanding how I produce information and how people are consuming, and be also open to having the conversation, not shutting it down when someone, you know, they come in and say, oh, I've seen this. And if that really resonates with them, me not completely dismissing that out of hat, but you know, working with them to understand why they think that's true for them, and then, you know, challenging that in an appropriate way. If I go in really didactic and just shooting the people down, that's not going to take them with them on the journey. So I would say to all of us as physios, our great skill is listening and communicating. So that's what we need to do and bring that information into the fore. Yes, ideally, we'd all have social media managers who would produce fantastic evidence, grade 1, you know, best content for us. I don't know about you guys, I don't have time or the energy for that right now. So I think the other route through that is to check and challenge that information, but by listening to the person in front of you. Sophie, you're probably a better person to answer that question than me as well.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's just that, as I said, lots of people read the title or the first words that pop up, they don't actually go and look for themselves. So it's just making sure there's no harm in saying it twice, because if they've got the wrong piece of information, at least you can try and help educate them, and so they know what it is instead of just, oh, I know, but do you actually know? So I think that's the difference.
Can I just add to that in relation to social media, but on a different topic? I have a paper under review at the minute about the influence of social media posts about diastasis and how they influence perception and behaviour in women with diastasis. And it's so interesting because it's qualitative, and basically what we found is that the women who landed on really influencery, non-evidence information, their algorithm meant that they were exposed to more and more and more and more, and they went down that rabbit hole. Some women were lucky and got really evidenced information, and they got more empowering and factual sort of information. So it's a double-edged, it can be really good or it can be really bad, and I think we have the power to voice it. You don't have to be a content creator, but retweet or reshare the evidence messages so that there's more of those getting out there and drowning out the BS, basically.
So we've got one more question.
I was just wondering, in terms of the menstrual cycle, I find a lot of like high rocks
marathon runners, triathletes come in who do display symptoms of REDS. So we'll often look holistically at all the different treatment for it, but it often means that they can't participate in the event that they wanted to, and very rarely they have been able to. And I was just wondering, in terms of kind of speeding up improvement in that, do you guys find the same, that I guess people only present themselves when it's got to a really bad point, and then they kind of do have to take the step back, but I always just feel that it's a shame because they never are able to do those events, and I guess more education around preventing them getting to that stage isn't necessarily out there, and just what your experience is with that.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I think the education isn't out there, and certainly, I mean, what you tend to find is with groups like High Rocks, CrossFit dancers, the little cultures within themselves. So there's a narrative in those groups that is repeated, shared, and they all believe it. So when one comes with the belief, they all come with the belief. So you're not just dealing with one person. But that can be quite useful, because if you get that person on your side and you change the narrative and they take it back to the group, then you get a change with it. But absolutely, I think that it's about, I agree with Grania, it's a bit like looking at the evidence. Where's the evidence for the thing where's the good evidence that actually, and where's the good practice? Give them a few things to do, and then tell them that will improve their performance. Because all they want to do is improve their performance. So if you say you can jump higher, run faster, lift heavier, it's like with CrossFit people who come with pelvic floor dysfunction, and in CrossFit, when you get a PR, you go and ring the bell, ding, 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 ding. Well, they're doing that when they're leaking, because they're thinking, hey, look at that, I'm lifting so heavy, I'm leaking. And I'll say, well, actually, you could probably lift I don't say, well, that's a terrible thing to do. What an awful thing to do to your pelvic floor. I'll say, listen, if you want to lift heavier, let's get you stop leaking. And then your lift will be heavier than it was before. So it's like listening to them, finding out what they want to achieve, and then working towards getting a plan in place to make that happen for them, for sure.
The only thing I would add to that is that you're always risk managing in those situations, because someone's the reason they may have ended up with RED-S could be long established for lots and lots of reasons, and therefore you may not have the skill set or the time that may take a long process to unpick. So I think we're enablers, so is you not always stopping people from doing things, but giving the information about the relative risk, and then just try and make little changes and trying to shift them forwards. Okay.
Thanks very much. I'm sorry, we're going to have to wrap it up. Do people mind if people contact them after the event, if you've got any questions? Hopefully you've got people's contact details, and hope we've opened the subject for wider discussion a little bit more today, and thanks very much for joining us. Yeah.
And I'd just like to thank Gillian and all of the speakers to this afternoon's session. I think it was really informative, and as I say, has opened up a really good conversation. Everyone's due back at 4:45, and if you haven't visited the posters, I'd really encourage you to go and have a look at some of the work that's out there. People have put a lot of time and effort into the research work that's up there. So I'd like to go and enjoy your afternoon tea and have a look at the posters. Thank you.
Thank you.